The rain drummed a relentless rhythm against the windshield, a hypnotic cadence that blurred the edges of reality. Ellie tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles pale under the muted glow of the dashboard lights. The road ahead stretched into the void, swallowed by darkness so complete it felt alive, shifting and breathing just beyond the reach of her high beams. Her phone sat on the passenger seat, the GPS app frozen on a pixelated map, a spinning wheel mocking her attempts to reconnect to civilization. She cursed under her breath, glancing at the barely legible signpost she'd passed moments ago. Crowhurst Hollow, 5 miles. The name lingered in her mind, heavy with an inexplicable unease. Her sister Sarah's voice echoed in her memory, warning her against taking shortcuts through rural roads, especially at night. But Ellie, ever impatient, had dismissed the advice with a casual laugh. The thought of her sister saying, "I told you so," brought a wry smile to her face, though the feeling didn't linger. The air inside the car felt different now, thicker, almost humid, despite the cold. She adjusted the rearview mirror and froze. In the momentary reflection, she thought she saw something, or someone, standing just off the road behind her car, a figure blurred by the rain-streaked glass, motionless and vaguely human. Ellie's heart jolted, a sudden frantic beat hammering in her chest. She blinked, and the road was empty again. "Get a grip," she muttered, forcing her gaze forward. The forest closed in tighter on either side, the skeletal branches overhead knitting into a black canopy that swallowed even the faintest glimmers of starlight. The car's engine hummed a monotonous tune, a fragile comfort against the oppressive silence pressing in from all sides. There wasn't another car in sight, not for miles. It felt as though she'd slipped into a forgotten corner of the world, one where time moved slower, where sound and light behaved differently. A chill crept along her spine as she caught movement in her peripheral vision, shadows flickering along the edge of the road. Her mind supplied rational explanations: the wind in the trees, the play of light on rain-soaked asphalt. But no amount of logic could stop the feeling that she wasn't alone. Her eyes flicked to the clock on the dashboard. It had stopped. No numbers, no blinking colon, just an empty, lifeless display. She frowned, reaching out to tap it, but her hand recoiled at the sudden static crackle from the radio. The dial spun on its own, a frenzy of hissing white noise, punctuated by faint whispers, words just out of reach, unintelligible, yet undeniably human. Ellie's breath hitched, her pulse quickening as she reached to turn it off. The knob resisted, almost as if the radio itself was alive, unwilling to let go. When it finally clicked off, the silence that followed felt even louder, a weight pressing down on her chest. She rolled down the window an inch, desperate for air, but the outside world offered no relief. The rain's rhythm was wrong now, too slow, too deliberate, as though it had become an imitation of rain rather than the real thing. She inhaled deeply, the damp, earthy scent of the forest mingling with something sharper, metallic. Blood? The thought surfaced unbidden, and she shook her head violently, forcing it away. Ahead, a faint light flickered through the trees, golden and warm, promising refuge. Relief flooded her, and she pressed the accelerator, her car groaning in protest as the tires struggled against the slick road. The light grew brighter, closer, but as she approached, something about it felt off. It wasn't the steady glow of a porch light or the beam of a lantern. It pulsed irregularly, like a dying fire gasping for breath. The outline of a structure emerged from the darkness, a dilapidated cabin leaning precariously to one side, its windows jagged and empty. The light spilled from within, spilling shadows that writhed like living things. Ellie slowed the car to a crawl, every instinct screaming at her to turn around, to keep driving. But her body betrayed her. Her foot eased off the gas. Her hand found the door handle, and then the car stalled. The engine sputtered once, twice, before falling silent, leaving her stranded in the suffocating dark. Ellie's breath fogged the windshield as she sat motionless. The only sound, the faint patter of rain and the echo of her own shallow breathing. The cabin loomed in the headlights, its splintered wood and sagging roof somehow more sinister than welcoming. The golden light still pulsed within, casting uneven shadows that danced against the jagged window panes. She fumbled for her phone, fingers trembling as she thumbed the power button. Nothing. The screen remained black, its lifelessness a stark contrast to the eerie glow spilling from the cabin. The rain had stopped, or perhaps it hadn't. Ellie couldn't hear it anymore. The silence pressed against her ears, thick and unnatural, as though the world had been smothered in a suffocating blanket. Her gaze returned to the cabin. Logic and fear battled within her. Someone might be inside, someone who could help. But every fiber of her being screamed that she should stay in the car, wait for daylight, and hope the engine roared back to life with the dawn. The decision was made for her when the car's headlights flickered, dimmed, and then extinguished, plunging her into a darkness so absolute she felt as though she'd been swallowed whole. Her heart thudded loudly, each beat a deafening drum against the void. A faint clicking sound came from the cabin, like a chain swaying in the breeze, or a rusty hinge slowly creaking open. Her hand found the door handle again, and this time it pushed open without resistance. Cold air rushed in, carrying that same metallic tang she'd noticed earlier. Stronger now, almost overwhelming. Her shoes squelched against the mud as she stepped out, the ground soft and spongy beneath her feet. The world seemed to tilt, the forest around her swaying unnaturally, as if the trees were leaning in to watch. Ellie moved toward the cabin, each step reluctant yet inexorable, as though an unseen force were pulling her forward. The air grew colder, biting at her skin and stealing the breath from her lungs. She crossed the threshold, her movements slow and deliberate, the light inside flickering like a dying star. The interior was sparse, the floorboards warped and rotting, the walls bare except for deep gouges that crisscrossed the wood. The light came from a single lantern on a rickety table, its flame unnaturally bright yet casting no warmth. Surrounding it were objects that sent a shiver down her spine. Old photographs, their edges singed, a child's doll with one eye missing, a bundle of twigs tied with crimson thread. Her gaze lingered on the photographs. They were grainy and black and white, but something about them was familiar. She picked one up, the edges rough and brittle. The image was of a woman standing in front of a tree, her face obscured by shadows. But Ellie recognized the outline of the tree. It was the one she'd passed on her drive, the twisted branches unmistakable. A noise behind her made her whirl around, the photograph fluttering to the floor. The door she'd entered through was gone. In its place was a solid wall, the wood seamless as though no door had ever existed. Her pulse spiked, panic clawing at her throat. She stumbled backward, her foot catching on something soft. She glanced down, and her stomach turned. It was a pile of shoes, muddy and mismatched, each one weathered with time. Some were small, barely larger than her hand. The lantern's flame sputtered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to stretch and twist into impossible shapes. The room grew colder still, and Ellie's breath came in shallow gasps, each exhale visible in the freezing air. A sound broke the silence, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You shouldn't have come." Ellie's body froze, the whisper slicing through her like a blade. It wasn't just a voice. It was layered, as if dozens of people were speaking in unison. She turned toward the source, her eyes darting wildly, but the room was empty. Then she saw it, a figure standing just beyond the lantern's glow. It was impossibly tall, its limbs long and crooked, its face obscured by a veil of shadows. The figure didn't move, but Ellie felt its gaze boring into her, cold and merciless. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, a cacophony of warnings and accusations. Her legs buckled, and she fell to her knees. The lantern flickered one last time before going out completely, plunging her into absolute darkness. The whispers stopped, replaced by silence so profound it seemed to crush her. And then she felt it, a cold hand on her shoulder,